here. It is the one that is going to control movement, or I guess fuel the movement of most of the other ions, small molecules that we're going to be talking about. Almost all of it is going to be reabsorbed, mainly because it's such a key player. Its reabsorption is coupled to several other ions and several other molecules. You don't get any amino acids or glucose reabsorption without sodium. So sodium specifically is going to be reabsorbed. Most of it is going to happen actually in the proximal tubules. About 2/3 of it will actually be reabsorbed very early on in the nephron. So it gets filtered, and then by the time you get to the tubes of Henle, you've already reabsorbed about 6 to 7%. The next 25% or so, about a quarter of it will be reabsorbed when we get through the loop of Henle. And then about 5% for the distal convoluted tubule, and like 3% once you get toward the connecting tubule, the collecting tubule, and the medullary collecting duct. So there's not a whole lot that's going to be reabsorbed in the distal segments, mainly because there's not a whole lot left. Most of it is going to be reabsorbed. That's part of the reason why your macula dental works by sensing the level of sodium chloride once you get to the distal part. To give you an idea about how much reabsorption is actually taking place, and will help to influence the rate of GFR. All right, so when we look at this figure, it's from the boron book. And what I really want to point out is just it gives you the same numbers, I have the same numbers that they give you, for each of the different segments. So up here in your proximal tubule, you have about 2/3 of the total filtered load. Now, that's not all sodium in your body, it's just a percentage of the amount that's filtered. So your filtered load is whatever the amount of that particular solute is that made it through to the GFR process. Okay, so at your glomerulus, you have a set filtration rate. And whatever solute, or whatever amount of that solute gets filtered at the glomerulus, that's your filtered load. So from whatever your filtered load is, 2/3 of that's going to be reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. About a quarter of that is going to be reabsorbed when you get to the loop of Henle. And then up here in your distal convoluted tubule, and then you get your connecting tubule and your collecting tubule, you're looking at about 5%, leaving the last remaining bit once you get into the medullary collecting duct. So there's not a lot happening in the distal side. Most of the absorption, or reabsorption, I should say, that you have occurring is going to be early on in the nephron. There is a, I guess it's a verbiage difference between what we talk about moving things from the lumen into the interstitial space and GI compared to what we talk about in the GI. And it's important to distinguish between the two. This is reabsorption. Okay? In the GI tract, it's absorption. Okay? The reason for that is because you're eating food and it's getting absorbed for the first time. In this case, you've already taken something out of the blood, you're filtering it, so you're deciding what to reabsorb back into the blood. All right? So, the amount that you're actually excreting, down here at the bottom, it's less than 0.5% of whatever is filtered for sodium. It's a very, very small amount because you don't want to lose a lot of sodium. So, this is just a recap. How are we going to process this in the nephron? We're going to filter it first, and then we might reabsorb it, we might secrete it. That's all going to depend on the transporters that are expressed and what degree they're expressed. But at the end of the day, whatever is left by the time you get to the end of that nephron segment, and jumping into the ureter, is going to be excreted. So, if we want to figure out how much is reabsorbed, basically what we know is that you're filtering more of this particular solute than you're actually excreting from the body. If you're filtering more than you're excreting, some of it had to be reabsorbed because you started off with a higher filter load and the amount that's actually leaving in the urine is lower. So how are we going to do that? How will we figure out reabsorption? First, we have to think about how much is going to be filtered. Okay, this is not just filtration rate in general. That's your GFR. Your GFR tells you what is the filtration rate of everything in your blood at any given time for a particular glomerulus. Okay? And I should say that the actual GFR that you're calculating, when you're doing it experimentally, you could isolate a single nephron and study it, but our GFR that we're going to discuss in this class is what we're calculating based on clearance rates. It's based on total filtration rate of all of the nephrons in your kidney. Okay, so some of them are going to have a higher filter load of certain ions, some of them are going to have less. So the filtration at each individual one might be a little bit different. And we'll get to that. That's going to become important when we start talking about carrier proteins that are involved, because they can actually become saturated. So if you want to calculate how much of a particular solute, in this case S, is filtered, you basically just take whatever the glomerular filtration rate is for everything, and then you multiply it by the concentration of that solute in the plasma. That's going to give you the filtration of that particular solute. From that point, you can calculate how much of that solute is excreted. That's basically what is the concentration that shows up in urine, and what's the flow rate of that urine. Okay, so both of these are going to take a rate of flow, so it's a volume per unit time, right? And it's going to multiply it by a concentration, so a mass per volume. All right? So GFR times plasma concentration will tell you how much is filtered for this particular solute, and your urine concentration times your urine flow rate will tell you how much of that is actually being excreted. What are we going to do with these? To figure out how much is reabsorbed. We're just going to subtract. That's the part at the top of there, right? So up here we have reabsorption is your filtration minus excretion. This is the calculation for filtration, and this is the calculation for excretion of your particular solute. So this is specific for sodium or calcium or glucose, whatever it is you want to calculate. This is how you would figure out how much of that is actually going to be reabsorbed. Okay? This is talking about net reabsorption. If you have a molecule or an ion that is reabsorbed and secreted, this is only going to tell you if you have net reabsorption. If you don't have net reabsorption and you have net secretion, is the filtered amount going to be greater than the excreted amount? No, because if you have net secretion, you're actually going to have more that you're excreting than you are filtering. Even if some of that is being reabsorbed, if more of it's being secreted, then you're going to see a difference in the relation here. Your filtration is going to be less than your excreting amount. So this is only telling you about the net movement, not total movement on a molecular level at each point. So let's look at secretion. I didn't change the title, sorry. That's supposed to be secretion. So we're going to look at net secretion, which is something that we talked about already with one particular molecule. Do you guys remember what it is? Not something we make. pH. Inulin is the one that is filtered, but nothing else happens. pH is the one that's filtered and then secreted, so it should be completely cleared from the blood on a single passage of the All right, so starting with this, we're looking at something where the amount that's excreted is going to be greater than the amount that's filtered. Okay, you're still going to have that same GFR, the same filtered load. You're going to calculate that in the same way, where you're figuring out that GFR times plasma concentration. The excretion amount is still going to be calculated also the same way. How much is showing up in the urine of that particular solute, what's the concentration in the urine, and then what's the flow rate. You figure out the GFR times the plasma concentration, and then you're going to take the difference between these two. Sorry. You're going to take the difference between these two in order to figure out how much is secreted. So what's the biggest difference between calculating reabsorption and calculating secretion? You're still going to do the same calculations at the bottom. What's the big difference? Which order do you put them? Okay? So if you were to take this calculation and you said, I'm going to take excretion minus filtration, and you get a negative number, what would that indicate? If your filtration is bigger than your excretion, you have reabsorption. Right? You get a positive number from the reabsorption equals filtration minus excretion. That positive number means filtration is greater. If you happen to calculate it where you calculated secretion, you did excretion minus filtration. If your filtration is bigger, you're going to end up with a negative number. So it's not secretion. You have a negative secretion. Okay, so you can either memorize both equations, or you can think logically about the relationship between how much is excreted and how much is filtered. Depending on which way you set it up, the positive or negative value can tell you which direction something is moving. Does that make sense? All right. Great question. I would like for you guys to match the rates of filtration, secretion. Oh, looks like my other ones are not showing up. All right, so match the rates of filtration and excretion for these two values based on the information that's provided. For sodium, we have sodium concentration in the plasma, we have the GFR, the urine flow rate, and concentration of sodium in the urine. Oh, they are showing up. Oh, good. Okay. They weren't showing up on my iPad, so I couldn't see them yet. Oh, good. They are showing up. Filtration, excretion, reabsorption, and secretion rate. So you're calculating these values based on, I can't make it show both of them at the same time because you can't show this time right here. GFR is 100 mils per minute. Anybody want some more time? A few more seconds. All right. I'm gonna stop you in 3, 2, 1. All right, so pretty good. All right, so our filtration amount is 14. Our reabsorption is 13.9. Our excretion is 0.1, and our secretion is 0. Now, technically, since we just talked about how to do this process, we didn't even really have to calculate this, right? Because we said that almost all of it's going to be reabsorbed from whatever the filter was. And nothing is secreted because it's a major player in the reabsorption. And a very tiny amount is excreted. But it is going to be important to understand how you would go through these calculations in case you get something that is not as intuitive as sodium. So I use sodium as an example, sort of as a way to kind of lead us through the whole thing, and we will walk through all of the calculations now. All right, so starting off with figuring out the filtration rate of our sodium. What are we going to use here? How are we going to figure that out? GFR times plasma concentration, okay? So if we're going to multiply these two, we're multiplying 100 times your 140, but you got to take into account that we're looking at 100 mils per min and 140 milliequivalents per liter. So that's why I put the liters per minute, because we want to make sure that our units are going to equate to each other. So if you have 0.1 liters per minute times 140 milliequivalents per liter, you get 14 milliequivalents per minute. Okay, so that's your filtration rate for sodium specifically, based on these stats. How about excretion? How do we calculate that? Concentration where? In the urine times urine flow rate. Okay, so flow rate times the concentration. In this case, again, we want to make sure that we're using the same units for volume. You'll get your concentration in milliliters. You might get it in deciliters. You need to know how to convert it into liters to make sure that all of your units are going to be in agreement. So stoichiometry, basic count, right? So we're going to take 0.001 liters per minute, multiply by 100 milliequivalents per liter, we get 0.1 milliequivalents per minute. So the rate at which you are filtering is 14, but you're only going to excrete 0.1. So how are we going to figure out the reabsorption? In this case, is your filtration greater or less than your excretion? Much greater. Okay, so do we have reabsorption or excretion? Reabsorption. Okay, so if you take your filtration and subtract your excretion, you're going to get that lovely 13.9 from the previous question. What if you did your secretion equation, which was your excretion minus your filtration? What do you get? Positive or negative number? Negative number. If you get a negative number, you don't have any secretion. Okay? Again, we're talking net movement. Okay? For overall processing of this particular ion in the kidneys. So all of your nephrons together. You have a net reabsorption. It also turns out that for sodium there isn't actually a secretion pathway. But we will see when we get to things like chloride, there is a reabsorption pathway and there's a secretion pathway. We'll see that with protons, we'll see that with bicarbs. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to move in both directions. But this series of equations is really going to give you net movement. Okay? How do we go? Good? Bad? Nobody wants to talk to me today? Good? Bad? Good? Okay. So I can move on. All right. So, let's get started. There will be figures that are coming from mostly the boron book because they have a lot more details, and most of the stuff that we cover will not show up in the molecular interior of the cells in the Guyton book. But I do put the Guyton books here, figures here as well, so that you have something to reference for that same content. If you're looking for it in the Guyton and you want to read around background. But the boron book will give you a lot more details. This would be something that would come from your Guyton book. And what we're really going to look at is the overall processing of the nephron. I want to talk quickly about two things that are going to be really important in everything that we talk about from this point on. We're going to have a paracellular pathway and a transcellular pathway for the movement of everything that we're getting reabsorbed or secreted. It's got one of two ways to go. It can either go in between the cells, that's a paracellular pathway. You can think of it as running parallel to the cell membrane. It's going in between the tight junctions of these neighboring epithelial cells. Okay, this does not involve any transporters, it doesn't involve any proteins that are going to help move, no carrier proteins, no channels, no pores, no nothing. It's a tight junction. So you have fluid and you have solutes that are going to be able to move paracellularly. Okay, this is for pretty much ions. Okay, very, very, very small particles that are going to be able to pass through those tight junctions. Transcellular means that it's going through the cell. If it's going through the cell, it has to cross two membranes, right? It has to get into one membrane, pass through the interior of the cell, and then get out the other membrane in order to pass completely through to the other side. In this case, we are looking at the lumen, okay? And then this would be your interstitial fluid going toward the blood. The lumen, that means that this membrane is called what? Okay? What is this membrane called? Basolateral. I can do it. All right, this is going to be important terminology to know because we're going to talk a lot about apical membranes and basolateral membranes, transcellular and paracellular movement. So it's important that you get this right at the outset. Okay? Apical is in contact with the lumen. That is the epithelial side that is directly in contact with your filtrate. That means that if you want something to be reabsorbed, it has to pass through the apical membrane first. Then it will pass transcellularly through that epithelial cell across to the basolateral membrane. Basolateral is next to the blood, if that helps you to remember it, B and B. Basolateral is the part that is on the blood side of the cell. Anything that passes across the basolateral membrane from the cell outside of the cell is going into the interstitial fluid space, and then it can be taken up by the capillary beds. Okay? If you want something to be secreted, it has to come from the interstitial space across the basolateral membrane first, through the cell, and then out the apical membrane to be secreted into the lumen, if it's a transcellular pathway. Paracellular can be reabsorbed or secreted, but it's not going to pass through any membrane. It's just going straight through those tight junctions. So another quick terminology reminder. Reabsorption is anything going from lumen eventually to blood, or at least to interstitial space. Anything that is being secreted is going from the blood or the interstitial space into the lumen. Excretion is what's leaving the body. Okay? You don't secrete something from the body, you excrete something from the body. You can secrete something into the lumen. So anything you add to the tubular fluid is secreted into it. Anything you take away from the tubular fluid is reabsorbed. Everybody clear on the two membranes, the different pathways?
Does the size of the arrow mean the size of the molecule, or the heat is the size of the particle?
Oh, so that will determine basically how much of a particular molecule or ion is moving. In this case, we're looking at sodium.
Okay,
So,
more will be transcellular.
yes, more is going to move in the transcellular path of sodium. This, it's not labeled as such, but because it's showing this ATP pump, that's the sodium potassium pump on the basolateral membrane. So anytime you see, and that's a good question, because anytime you see any of these figures coming up, if it's a large or a fat arrow, we're talking about a larger percentage of that solute moving by that mechanism. So in this case, when we're looking at sodium, a lot of it's going to move in the transcellular pathway, some of it's going to move in the paracellular pathway. Okay. Now, sodium specifically. This is from the boron book, and these are your driving forces for sodium movement. So if your lumen is here, and your interstitial space is over here, which membrane is this one? Basolateral. And which membrane is this one? Apical. Okay? So we have, at the very beginning of your proximal convoluted tubule. In the very early segments, after filtration occurs, you have a relatively negative, millivoltage compared to the interstitial space. But the inside of your cell is just like every other cell in your body. It is going to be a negative millivoltage compared to the outside of the cell. Okay? So, if you were sodium, which way do you want to move if you're going transcellularly? You want to go into the cell, right? You have a driving force because you have a nice concentration that is showing up on the luminal side. There's a concentration gradient and there is an electrical gradient that will want sodium to move into the cell. So it's going to move downhill to get across the apical membrane. Once inside the cell, it's going to have to be pumped out the other side. And the reason for that is because we're looking at roughly equivalent concentrations on the luminal side and on the interstitial fluid side, but we have a much lower concentration inside the cell. This should be old hat by now. This is the status quo for everything else because sodium is always going to be low inside the cell. Why? Why is sodium low intracellularly? What keeps it low? Sodium potassium pump. Okay, every cell in your body's got a sodium potassium pump. Okay, so if that sodium potassium pump is present in every single one of your epithelial cells, you're going to have the same gradients that you see for sodium and potassium. Potassium is going to be high, sodium is going to be low. So there's always going to be a concentration gradient. There's also an electrical gradient to get sodium into the cell. So it's going to want to move very easily. It's also moving, you have a roughly equivalent sodium concentration on the luminal side and on the interstitial fluid side as you move through the proximal tubule. So we have overall movement transcellularly for reabsorption. Okay, most of it is going to move that way at this part of the nephron. It's important to note what the luminal voltage is compared to the interstitial voltage because that will change as we move along the nephron segments. So the impetus for sodium or chloride or any charged ion to move paracellularly to the lumen or out of the lumen is going to change based on that luminal voltage relative to the interstitial space. So the interstitial space here is 0. The luminal voltage of the proximal, early segments of the proximal tubule is -3. What does that mean? Where does sodium want to go? Paracellularly. Back into the lumen. Okay, so this we typically refer to as back leak instead of secretion. Because it is it's really just the electrical voltage at this point that causes a little bit of sodium to leak back in. Why? It's going to offset all of the sodium that's being reabsorbed in order to fuel the movement. We don't have any other way to pump sodium out of the cell back into the lumen to keep fueling all of these coupled transporters. If you have sodium potassium pump on the apical membrane, that's bad. Okay, because it would constantly, any sodium that gets inside would just be pumped back into the lumen. So it's important that the expression of your sodium potassium pump stays normal on the basolateral side. So how do you restore some of that sodium? You have it leak back through along its electrical gradient. There's no chemical gradient here because the concentration in the interstitial space in the lumen is the same. It's strictly electrical gradient. And this is in the proximal tubule. Okay, that's going to change as we get down into the loop assembly. So, sodium movement is really a pump leak process. Sodium will move transcellularly down its gradient on the apical side, and then it's pumped out the basolateral side from that sodium potassium pump. In the proximal tubule, it will leak back into the lumen because of the luminal negative voltage. So this is your pump leak model of your sodium as it moves in the early part of the nephron. How do we feel so far? Okay. This is the same basic figure, but from Guyton. Okay? So like I said, I will walk you through on one figure, but then I will also just insert the other figure so that if you want to reference this and locate the content that this is covering in the other book, that will be here as well. The part that kind of is annoying is that they are backwards. Okay, so the interstitial fluid in Guyton is on the left, the tubular lumen is on the right, whereas you saw in the boron book, the interstitial is on the right and the tubular lumen is on the left. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about what's going on through the boron references. These ones are here just to serve as a reference point for you. Okay, so we're going to get into the complicated part here, but I want to introduce just in a very simplistic figure, again from your Guyton book, that just shows how we have sodium allowing for the movement of your glucose and your amino acids. So here, we're coupling sodium with the movement of nutrients in the proximal tubule. If any of your amino acids that were filtered or your glucose that was filtered makes it past the proximal tubule without getting reabsorbed for whatever reason, it shows up in the urine. This is the only place in the nephron that you get glucose and amino acids being able to be reabsorbed. Why? This is the only place that these transporters are expressed. Okay, so specifically we're going to talk about glucose. Any glucose or amino acids that get past the proximal tubule and they escape the ability to be reabsorbed by one of these co-transporters, they're going to show up in the urine. Okay? This figure was really intended initially just to demonstrate the difference between co-transport and counter-transport or exchange. Oh, it's not letting me write. Co-transport at the top just means that the molecules on your apical side are moving in the same direction. Your counter-transport is that they're moving in opposite directions. Okay, sodium's in black, and what it's fueling the movement of is in red. So I don't typically use the word counter-transport because that's not usually what's used when we're referring to your sodium proton pump down there. NHE is sodium proton exchanger. Okay, so usually we'll talk about co-transporters and we'll talk about exchangers. Exchanger just means antiport, right? Your counter-transport. All right, so we'll zoom in up here. We're looking at your early proximal convoluted tubule. From the luminal side, we have a negative voltage, which you can see up at the top. And these are the transporters that we've talked about a little bit so far. Your glucose coupled with sodium, that's also going to be other transporters that are coupled with sodium, including your amino acids. You also have the sodium proton exchanger on your apical membrane. What is the benefit of this? What's it doing in the urine eventually? So it will be, well, it depends on the status of the body once you get past this point. But what is the benefit of adding protons? You're acidifying it. What does your body produce every time it digests anything from the cellular level? Acid, right? Metabolism by default produces acid. Organic acids, it produces actual protons. Your pH would drop significantly if you didn't have a way to get rid of those excess protons. So when we actually get to the acid-base lecture, which is the last one in the unit, this is going to come into more play, where we talk about protons being mainly secreted and reabsorption or generation of new bicarb in order to neutralize the acids that your body's producing. So on the apical membrane, we have our sodium moving at the top and all along the left-hand side, on the membrane transcellularly, it's going down its concentration gradient, and it's fueling the movement of other molecules. There are two parts where it's showing paracellular movement, okay? You have paracellular movement that is showing up on the bottom that would be considered reabsorption. That is following fluid. Have any of you heard the term solvent drag? If not, what's a solvent? Fluid, right? It's the thing you're diluting something in. So basically, solvent drag is the ability of fluid to move paracellularly and pull along some ion along with it through that paracellular route. So there will be some solvent drag that will help sodium to move across that, that barrier. That is not really governed by an electrical gradient or really a chemical gradient because they're roughly equivalent in the interstitial space and the lumen. And the top there shows sodium the way it would want to move based on its electrical gradient. It will leak back on its own because of the negative intraluminal voltage. But you can have small amounts of it that will just follow water through the paracellular route. Okay, so your proximal tubule is going to reabsorb a lot of sodium. It's going to reabsorb a lot of chloride we're going to see later on as well, but a lot of other molecules are going to be reabsorbed alongside sodium. On your basolateral side, we have a couple of different ways for sodium to get back out. The biggest player is your sodium-potassium pump. There are some other channels that can have a role. The sodium bicarb co-transporter, because they're moving in the same direction, will play a role when we start talking about acid-base balance and how we can get in the proximal tubule bicarb to end up being produced and sent back into the interstitial space. Okay? On the top, that little hexagon that's pink, that's your glucose. That's just the glucose transporter that's on the basolateral side. All right, so that's the early part of your proximal tubule. S1. So you have S1, 2, 3 segments. This is the S1 segment that's representative of what you would find there. Most of your nutrients are going to move in the early parts of the proximal tubule. For your thick ascending limb, this is going to be a fun one. You guys are going to probably spend quite a bit of time looking at an enlarged figure of this that we're going to get to a little later on because there's a lot of stuff happening in the thick ascending limb. But as an initial introduction, what do you notice about the luminal voltage at this point? Positive. Okay? So we started off with negative, but now we have a positive luminal voltage, which means what for sodium wanting to move paracellularly? It's not going to be back leaked in. It's going to start going paracellularly on its own based on that electrical gradient. Sodium is also going to continue to serve as a conduit for the movement of other molecules. Sodium and chloride and potassium have a co-transporter in the thick ascending limb across the apical membrane. And you have that sodium proton exchanger also existing on the apical membrane, both of which are going to help with sodium moving across inside the cell for that transcellular route. But sodium is moving all of it in one direction once you get to the thick ascending limb. What else do we know about the cells in the thick ascending limb in terms of permeability of the fluid? Not really permeable to water. It's functionally impermeable to water. That actually lasts all the way up into the initial part of the distal convoluted tubule. The very initial segments sort of reflect what you see in the thick ascending limb. But at the top here, it's showing that it's impermeable to water. On the right-hand side, we have the same sodium-potassium pump that will get sodium out, except instead of bicarb being coupled with sodium in a co-transporter like we saw on the proximal tubule, now we have it as an exchanger with chloride. Okay, so chloride will enter into the cell in exchange for bicarb being able to get out. That's going to come up again, like I said, in the lecture 22, the acid base. One part I want to talk about is for our thick ascending limb, specifically this transporter. That sodium potassium 2-chloride co-transporter is going to be the target of a diuretic that is really efficient at producing diuresis. Anybody know what it's called? Furosemide. Or Lasix, if you like brand names. But I would, if I were you, I would memorize the non-brand name because that's what you're going to get on the exams and stuff. We're looking at furosemide is going to inhibit this specific channel. That channel stops sodium, potassium, and 2 chlorides from being able to move into the cell and make sure that they stay in the lumen. Okay? As such, they all act as osmotically active agents, which means fluid stays in, less fluid gets reabsorbed, and that's what produces your diuresis. It also has an impact on calcium reabsorption, which we'll talk about when we get to that giant figure I was mentioning earlier. All right, so on the basolateral membrane, which maybe I should go back here and point that out again. Up at the top, you have potassium channel to allow potassium to move out. Same thing over here in your proximal tubule. It's right below your sodium potassium pump. You also have potassium channels that exist on the basolateral side. Why? Well, what else is on the basolateral side in terms of potassium? What's on the basolateral side of every cell? Sodium potassium pump. Where does that pump potassium? Into the cell. What happens if you pump it into the cell using ATP and you have no way to get it back out on the basolateral side? What if you had channels that were on the apical side? What would be the result? Basolateral sodium potassium pump and apical potassium channels. Massive secretion, which means what for your blood? Hypokalemia, which means what for your heart? Bad news. Okay? So the purpose of having these channels, just straight up potassium channels that reside alongside of your sodium potassium pump on the basolateral membrane, is really there to allow potassium to be continually cycled. You have to get all that sodium that's being taken up by the apical side out of the cell. The main way that we do that is the sodium potassium pump. We get lots and lots of sodium out, but we get it at the expense of secreting potassium into the cell. So without those basolateral potassium channels, you're going to end up with a hypokalemic state, provided that you're going to get more potassium coming out the apical side. Because there will be some segments of the nephron that have channels on the apical side as well. If they don't, eventually you're going to have a hard time accommodating all of that intracellular potassium. All right, so chloride. This one, I want to say this one either came from a paper or it came from the Bird and Levy book. For chloride reabsorption, specifically in this figure, we're looking at the proximal tubule. Okay, so here's your interstitium, and here's your lumen. Where's chloride coming in on the apical side? If we're getting reabsorption, we know it has to come in somewhere. Is it coming in on its own through a channel, or is it coupled? Where? Coupled with what? Formate. Okay. Chloride is coming in down here. Now, this lovely situation is what's called tertiary active transport. Primary active transport is ATP being hydrolyzed in order to fuel an individual channel, right? secondary active transport is some ATP usage to maintain these gradients, and that gradient is exploited to fuel the uphill movement of another molecule. So it's still looking at secondary active transport would be one particular channel, either a co-transporter or an exchanger, but it's using the gradient of most of the time sodium, but not always. It's using the gradient of one ion to fuel the uphill movement of another. That gradient had to be generated by something. Okay? In this case, we're looking at tertiary. So that means we have the channel that we actually care about that's moving your molecules that were of interest. In this case, your chloride and your formate. It's called pedrin. It's just a specific exchanger that resides on the apical membrane of the proximal tubule. And, excuse me. Oh, never mind. I won't get to the side there. But let's talk just about this channel. This one is going to allow for chloride to come into the cell for reabsorption at the exchange of formate. Formic acid, once it's inside of the lumen, can diffuse across the membrane. Right above that, we see ammonia inside the cell that can diffuse across the membrane easily to form ammonium when you get into the lumen. How does ammonium get formed? That proton from that sodium proton exchanger. So that sodium proton exchanger is responsible for downhill movement of sodium to allow for acidification of the lumen. The acidification of the lumen is what takes that formate and creates formic acid so that it can be recycled back into the cell. Once it's inside the cell, it can dissociate to form formate that now can be used to help shuttle chloride in. Okay, so tertiary active transport, because we have a sodium-potassium pump that generates that sodium gradient. That sodium gradient fuels proton secretion to acidify the lumen. That acidification allows for the exchanger molecule of the chloride formate exchanger to be acidified so that it can be recycled back inside the cell to continue to serve as a substrate for that exchange. So you don't get chloride moving unless there's sufficient amounts of formate inside the cell, because both of them need to move together. You don't get enough formate if you can't get the formic acid back inside the cell to dissociate and continue to fuel that chloride formate exchanger. How much do we love renal now? Does anybody have any questions about this tertiary active transport? Because we're talking about three different channels, three different proteins that are working together. Two on the apical, one on the basolateral that's maintaining that sodium-potassium pumping to maintain that gradient. And then just the passive diffusion of the conjugate base and acid that help to maintain this whole system. But they're all working together. If one of them stops working, then they're all going to stop working. All right, so chloride getting inside the cell transcellularly happens by this mechanism. Fortunately, it's really easy to get out the other side. It's just a potassium chloride co-transporter. That's a channel that just allows it to move across the basolateral side. All right, how do we feel about that so far? This is proximal tubule. It will get different when we get further along the nephron. Yes?
So why is it active transport? Is it chloride?
So your chloride, normally what's going to happen is in the early parts of the proximal tubule, you're going to have what kind of luminal voltage?
Early on, negative.
Yeah, it's going to be negative. So would chloride want to stay or leave?
Leave.
It would want to leave. Okay, that would be something that would help to drive it across paracellular pathways. But what kind of voltage do you have inside the cell? Much more negative than the negative three that you would have in the lumen.
Yeah.
So inside the cell, you still have that negative 70. So chloride itself, at this point, there's not really a concentration gradient. Later on, there'll be a concentration gradient that wants it to move inside the cell. But there isn't really one at this early point in the proximal tubule. So the only thing we have to contend with is an electrical gradient. And in this case, transcellular movement would not be favored for the movement of chloride. Good question. All right. Okay. Or are we totally lost? Seriously, nobody wants to talk to me today. I'm going to keep going if you don't tell me that you have questions. Yeah.
So just to clarify, it won't move paracellularly at all then? Or will it move, based on what you just said? About
So,
gradients?
paracellularly, which way do you think it would go at this point? Would it move or would it not, based on what we said about the lumen voltage compared to what the interstitial voltage is from the previous slides? Anybody want to help her? What's in the interstitium? What's the voltage in the interstitium? It's roughly 0 at this point, okay? In the early proximal tubule, you will have a negative voltage inside the lumen. It's small, about -3. And in the interstitial space, it's 0. So you will have some movement of water and solutes, chloride being one of those, because of the small negative voltage inside of the lumen that will want to repel that chloride to push it paracellularly. So you get reabsorption happening basically by 2 different mechanisms. Most of it's going to move transcellularly, but you have a small amount of paracellular movement as well. When you get to the I need it now. When we get to the late proximal tubule heading into the loop of Henle, the voltage inside your lumen is going to change. Okay, it's going to become more positive. So what's going to happen to the movement of chloride once you get to the late part of the proximal tubule, when you start to have a more positive luminal voltage? What would that normally do if there were no concentration gradient to chloride? Which way would it want to move? It would move back into the lumen. It doesn't, but not because of the fact that it doesn't have an electrical gradient. As all of these negative ions are starting to be reabsorbed, along with your positive ions, the voltage in the lumen from the beginning of the proximal tubule to the end and going into the loop of Henle now becomes positive. When it's a positive voltage, negative anions, so anions like chloride, would normally be attracted to that new positive luminal voltage, right? But we've now established a concentration gradient as well. Because all the chloride that was inside the cell has been pumped out the other side, you have a remaining high concentration on the luminal side that allows it to override that electrical gradient that would want paracellular movement. Okay, so the concentration gradient of chloride basically overrides that electrical attraction for chloride secretion paracellularly when you get to the late part of the proximal tubule. So even though your electrical gradient will shift, you've now generated a concentration gradient, which didn't exist in the beginning of the proximal tubule. Okay, so chloride paracellular movement in the first segments of the proximal tubule, strictly moving reabsorption because negative negative luminal voltage, 0 for interstitial space. When you get to the late part of the proximal tubule going into the loop of Henle, you still have paracellular reabsorption, except it's due to the concentration gradient because now chloride would want to stay in that more positive environment. but you've generated a concentration gradient, so now there's a concentration gradient that pulls for reabsorption. So you still get reabsorption all the way through for the paracellular pathway. The transcellular is always reabsorption here. Okay. Sorry. All right. All right, we're doing pretty well. We got about 20 minutes. So let's start talking about calcium. Calcium specifically is going to be very important, obviously, for your bones, for your muscles, for most cells in the body. Most of it, just like sodium, is going to be reabsorbed. It's going to be reabsorbed pretty much everywhere you look. Proximal tubule, thick ascending limb, as well as the convoluted tubule. We are not really talking a lot about the descending limb of the lipid or the thin segment of the ascending limb. That will come up later when we start talking about water permeability and when we talk about urea permeability. Okay, it's just that it's not very permeable because there's no expression of the channels that we're discussing for the movement of solutes in terms of ions and nutrients. So, proximal tubule, thick ascending limb, and distal convoluted tubule are the ones that are going to help move calcium. In your proximal tubule, you have two different ways for it to move. You have diffusion based on a concentration gradient and a lumen negative voltage. That's on the bottom. You also have calcium following the solvent drag that's shown in paracellular movement at the top. The transcellular pathway is from calcium channels that reside on the apical membrane that allow it to come in down its concentration gradient into the cell. It's also an electrical gradient because the cell is negative and it's a positive ion, so it wants to enter in down its electrical gradient. To get out the other side, you have a calcium, PMCA, it's a plasma membrane calcium ATPase. That's actually on the bottom. It does function with proton exchange. And then you also have your sodium calcium exchanger. Both of these are on the basolateral side, and both of them will pump calcium back out of the cell in order to make sure that it's being reabsorbed in the interstitial space. So you have transcellular reabsorption, and you have paracellular reabsorption, either by diffusion directly or just following as part of the solvent tract. So it's kind of a straightforward process for calcium. This is the simplified version that is from your guidebook. This is the simplified version of the thick ascending limb of the This is why I'm showing the simplified version before we get into the more complicated version. Okay? So, to start off, the sodium-potassium 2-chloride cotransporter is on the apical membrane. You still have that sodium proton exchanger, so you're still acidifying the urine, but you have a lot of sodium coming in along with potassium and chloride. This is the target of your loop diuretics, furosemide being the most popular. It's prescribed a lot for people who have congestive heart failure, who are developing an accumulation of fluid in the body, because this is one of the most effective producers of diuresis, so the loss of fluid from the body. And then on the basolateral side, you have your same sodium-potassium ATPase. There will be potassium channels on both the apical and the basolateral membrane, basically just to recycle that potassium on both sides, to continue fueling these pumps. So, the thick ascending limb up here will just show that same loop diuretic. That same transporter on the left, and this is akin to what we're going to see expanded in the boron figure that's coming up in just a second. The loop diuretics, your furosemide actually competes. It's a competitive inhibitor for chloride binding site. So furosemide will specifically outcompete chloride if it's present. It will stop the function of this because you need all 4 of those ions to be able to bind to that cotransporter in order to get it to move. The other part that I want to point out is something that we're going to talk about because we introduced the topic of calcium reabsorption. This is actually going to play a role in calcium reabsorption, the sodium-potassium 2-chloride cotransporter. On the right, you see it looks, I don't know, like pectin with calcium. That's the receptor for calcium being able to be sensed. If there's sufficient amounts of calcium inside the body, in the interstitial fluid, we don't need to reabsorb more. So one of the ways that they stop reabsorption is by inhibiting both your sodium potassium chloride cotransporter and your apical potassium channels. Okay, so how are these going to stop chloride from being reabsorbed? Calcium, sorry, calcium. It's going to stop chloride directly. Thank you. It's going to stop calcium as well as your sodium, your potassium, and your chloride. So, over here on the right, this is from your boron program. There's a lot going on here. So when we're looking specifically at calcium, so let me just interstitial space, just for context, tubular lumen on the left. So we're looking at your apical membrane here, and we're looking at your basolateral membrane on the right. We still have the same things that we saw before in terms of how calcium is going to get out. Right? So how does calcium get out? It gets out by these two channels. It's not showing your sodium potassium pump, but that's always here. So just imagine that's always present on this side. On your apical side, we have calcium channels that allow it to be taken up. This is your transcellular pathway to allow for movement into the cell and then the pump to allow it to move out of the cell. But we also have paracellular movement that is due to that positive voltage in the lumen. Okay? That positive voltage in the lumen is generated by these two guys. How do you get a positive accumulation of positive charges in the lumen? By these two channels.
Well, we have one sodium, one potassium, two chloride. That's net zero going in and potassium leaving.
Exactly. These two are going to be coupled. They're going to work together. Your sodium, potassium, 2-chloride cotransporter is an electrically neutral cotransporter. 2 positive and 2 negative moving in. You see that? But in order to make sure that this is going to continue to be fueled, you have an apical potassium channel that allows for potassium to be secreted from the inside of the cell back out into the tubular lumen. That means that there is a net movement of positive charge into the lumen of the thick ascending limb, creating that positive luminal voltage. That is the driving force for this paracellular uptake of calcium. How do we feel so far? All right, one thing I do want to point out here is that you also have a receptor for parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is going to do what to reabsorption of calcium? Increase or decrease? Increase, because why is it released? You don't have enough calcium. So if you get the sense, your parathyroid hormone or gland gets the sense that you don't have enough calcium, it will function to increase the release of parathyroid hormone, which will bind to basolateral receptors to stimulate the production of this cascade. So what we're first looking at here is this production of arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid, along with your cytochrome P450, is going to produce 20 P3, like hydroxyisosa tetranoic acid. So that functions to inhibit these if you have sufficient amounts of calcium already in the body. If you don't, what do you want to do? You want these to continue to function. So this will help to shut off if you have enough calcium showing up outside of the interstitial space. So when your parathyroid hormone can function to help to increase and upregulate the calcium channels that we'll see here, these channels are going to be upregulated directly in response to your calcium channels. Not just here, but also in the distal convoluted tubule. TRPC5 and 6 are the isoforms of your calcium channel that all have phosphorylation sites based on protein kinase A, and allows them to be upregulated in response to the signaling cascade you get from parathyroid hormone. But there's a feedback mechanism that allows it to shut off if you have enough calcium. It's the same basic feedback mechanism that you see in the parathyroid gland. So under normal circumstances, you get parathyroid being released if you have low calcium. If you have sufficient amounts of calcium, there's a receptor up here that is your calcium sensing receptor, so CASR. Basically, if there's enough calcium, it will bind to this receptor, and what it does is it shuts down cell growth of the thyroid gland. It also produces elevated levels of vitamin D3, DAG, which means lots of calcium. Calcium will activate and produce arachidonic acid, and that will inhibit the release of parathyroid hormone. The other thing that happens over here is that you actually will increase the expression of your vitamin D receptor, and if your VDR expression goes up, that also decreases the amount of parathyroid hormone being released. But this signaling cascade, by activating the production of arachidonic acid, will stop parathyroid hormone from being released. It's the same thing that we see here when arachidonic acid is the intermediate to allow for shutting down of calcium reabsorption. So it works in the parathyroid hormone to stop parathyroid from being released to tell the rest of the body to reabsorb calcium. And it actually stops in the kidneys as well. So the kidneys have two different ways of responding to the need for calcium. You can either get a signal from parathyroid hormone to upregulate those calcium channels or increase the probability that they're open. It can also do it on its own. It doesn't have to get a signal. The renal system doesn't have to get a signal from parathyroid glands in order to know if there's sufficient amount of calcium, because it has its own calcium sensing receptor. That is down here. That calcium sensing receptor itself means that even if there was some kind of glitch in the function of your parathyroid gland, the kidneys themselves can tell if we need to increase the amount of calcium that's being taken up or not. It does it by a couple of different pathways. One is that it can actually generate an increase in calcium by G-alpha-2. So this is G protein coupled receptors. There are two receptors that are coupled either to GQ or to GI. Well, and GO, I guess I should say. These are going to function to generate the arachidonic acid that will help to inhibit your sodium potassium chloride transporter as well as your apical potassium channels. The same thing happens when you have elevated levels of calcium. Protein kinase C has, both of these have phosphorylation sites that allow for the phosphorylation of the NAKCl cotransporter, which also shuts it down. What else will shut down NAKCl? Pharmacological. Furosemide. So what effect would furosemide have on calcium in the body? It would reduce the amount that was being reabsorbed. A byproduct of furosemide is that you can actually have more calcium showing up when you treat it. So anything that shuts down the NAKCl and that potassium channel is going to reduce the overall movement of calcium from the tubular lumen into the interstitial space. It can happen because you're taking the loop diuretic. It can happen because parathyroid gland is not coming in to continue to upregulate those channels, or it could happen from the signaling cascade due to the calcium sensing receptor on the vasolateral side of the epithelial cells and cells in the kidney. So several different ways that you can modify the activity of this very important co-transporter that will produce diuresis and also increase the amount of calcium showing up in the urine. So it's all based on need. Okay. I know that was a lot. How do we feel about that so far? All right. So parathyroid hormone specifically, it's released, just as a summary, this slide is really just text as a summary. It's going to be released by the gland in response to lower extracellular calcium. It's going to increase reabsorption in the kidneys. It'll also increase reabsorption in the gut. It does have the side effect of decreasing phosphate reabsorption, which will have a role in talking about acidification of the urine. And it does help to increase the extracellular calcium because of all of this reabsorption that's happening. So this is just a summary because most of the calcium can be held in your muscles and your bones. It's also a source for extracellular or blood levels of calcium to be able to move in your body. But the intestines and the renal system are really the main parts for being able to get absorption of calcium. And the parathyroid hormone acts on all of these different markers. All right. We only have about 3 minutes left, so I'll just get into the next little bit as we start getting into the distal tubule, and then we'll finish everything up on Thursday. So for the distal tubule, we're looking at, again, the boron, the Guyton book. So our lumen is on the right-hand side. Instead of having a sodium potassium chloride transporter, we now have a sodium chloride transporter. Okay? This is going to be subject to thiazide diuretics. They will inhibit this particular co-transporter that resides in the early distal tubule. So around the area where it comes back into juxtaposition with the afferent arterioles and where the macula densate is. Thiazide diuretics are very effective. They do not really produce as much diuresis as you find with the loop diuretics because they're not influencing as many ions, but they are going to be very effective. One of the problems with this, though, is that you can actually lose potassium. So if you're already in a hypoglycemic state, this would not be one of those diuretics that you would want to use. Why? Because you have sodium and chloride being inhibited. Normally what would happen is you would have the secretion of potassium coming in response to that reabsorption. If you inhibit this, you're going to end up with calcium imbalance, mainly due to the fact that you're not fueling that movement as much. On the boron slide, which actually this one is, these are mostly from the Guyton book. Just to lead through, we are going to get into potassium movement when we get to lecture 21, I believe. But this is a quick introduction before we get heavily into the late distal tubules, early and late, as well as the collecting tubules. You'll see a huge change in the early distal tubule movement of solutes compared to what is happening in the late distal and collecting tubules. We have different types of cells that are going to function in the movement of ions, either being reabsorbed or secreted, based on which type of expression of those cells. We have principal cells, and then we have intercalated cells in your collecting tubules. The principal cells, their big job is to secrete potassium. That secretion of potassium is going to be really important in the most distal part of the nephron. Channels that are going to be, or diuretics that can block these, you have aldosterone antagonists. Spironolactone is a good example, and amiloride we already mentioned that has to do with your epithelial sodium channel. Aldosterone does what? Sodium reabsorption by what means? What does it upregulate? Anybody know?
NAK, ATPase.
It upregulates this guy. It increases the activity of your sodium potassium. Okay? So because of that, it also influences the movement of potassium. So we'll pick up here on the cortical collecting tubules on Thursday, and we should be able to get through the rest of the material
By
by
the end of that class period.